So friends and colleagues at Lloyd and of the United Nations Association in Canada, and all those who have been generous enough to give us opportunities to speak and to celebrate this remarkable event. So I'm delighted to offer on behalf of the Pearson family, somebody once called us the Pearson Posse, and I'm beginning to think there's some truth in that, because it's not only on behalf of the family, the whole family, but also of three particular members. And Lloyd reminded me today of my daughter Catherine, who guided him around Central America, and alas, whose 9th anniversary of her death we commemorate today. So, but in addition to Catherine more closely, it was Michael, my son, who was his aide, and myself as his advisor on children's rights. So Michael sends his very best from Brussels and comments, quote, that the role of political policy aid to a minister, which is what he was, is to offer views and help manage ideas and initiatives, and working for Lloyd meant you were doing this constantly. He was a genius at thinking up ideas and looking for innovative ways of doing things, which can be tricky when you're trying to move a traditionally slow-moving bureaucracy like foreign affairs, let alone the international community. But the important thing is that on so many issues, Lloyd was able, as Michael goes on to say, to seize the moment, as in the international treaty to ban anti-personal landmines that became known because of Lloyd as the Ottawa Treaty. My own role with respect to Lloyd was a somewhat different one. In May 1996, he officially invited me to act as his advisor on children's rights, noting that children's rights had become a key priority for the Liberal government, and that I was then serving in the Senate. And it was actually in the speech from the throne. It was very exciting. I don't think it's ever come back, the speech from the throne, but it was there that time. This appointment enabled me to draw on government resources and support for the many opportunities to advance children's rights that opened up in the late 1990s. A window of opportunity that closed, alas, with a bang on 9/11, when priorities shifted dramatically for all governments to the war on terror. That being said, many of the initiatives Lloyd took at the time remain in place, and I will always be grateful for the part that you enabled me to play, Lloyd. Lloyd's achievements that qualify him for this award are so many that I can't list them all, and I have decided instead to group them according to the 4 phases of peace that Lester Pearson described nearly 60 years ago in his Nobel Prize lecture. In that lecture, which he clarified all the elements he believed to be essential to sustaining a peaceful world that would allow humankind to flourish. As a participant in the First World War and a close observer of the Second, as he watched the bombs falling on London during the Blitz, and among the letters from Mr. Pearson that we have in our possession, or had in our possession, are these remarkable letters describing what it was like to be there during the Blitz. And he was always cheerful. He never sort of, I think he was trying to keep people at home cheerful. He was writing to his family, of course. But this amazing description of the spirit of the English, but also the spirit of the Canadians who were serving at that time in the mission. But because of all this, he was only too conscious of the cruelty and destructive nature of armed conflict. And towards the end of the war, when he was in Washington, he worked hard to put in place the institutions and the normative structures that would preserve humankind from destroying itself, as it almost had, and heaven forbid, may yet. Now, a dozen years after the end of the war and the founding of the UN, he was still looking for the best way forward. And it was the guidelines he set out then that guided him for the rest of his life, and after his death, became the basis of the criteria which Kate has just read out that are established for the Pearson Peace Medal. Lloyd Axworthy fulfills every one of these criteria. And I'd like to talk a bit about what he's done and continues to do through the prism of the 4 phases of peace that the Nobel lecture emphasized. Peace and prosperity, peace and power, peace and policy, peace and people. And I'd like to recommend, actually, you can go on the, you can Google the lecture through the Nobel site. And it's very much worth reading because it stands up extremely well. My father-in-law was not always a great public speaker, but he was a great writer. And he was a very good speaker in small groups. He had a great sense of humor, as some of you who knew him can remember. So growing up in North Winnipeg, with coming from a United Church background, which focused on the social gospel, and I can see that Lois here would understand that very well, this question of the social gospel. And what's so interesting in the work that we've been doing, that Patricia and I have been doing on all the laureates, is how many of them come from that kind of background, even though it's not, I mean, it's Protestant, Jewish, Catholic, it's not Quaker, lots of Quakers. It's not specific, but it's some kind of sense that social gospel means that we have this responsibility to the whole world, to all people in the world. Lloyd, I know, has always been conscious of the effects of poverty on both individuals and society, and he's done his best to address them both in urban settings and in the indigenous population that he's been working with more latterly, and abroad. 60 years ago, Lester B. spoke of, I tend to call him Lester B., you'll just have to forgive the shortening, spoke of peace being dependent on lessening the disparities between the rich and poor nations and between the rich and the poor. Partners in Development, the report he chaired for the World Bank after he left politics, set a standard for partnership that Canada, alas, has never quite even been close to. And I can only imagine, I'd be interested to get your opinion, Lloyd, afterwards, some arguments that you may have had in Cabinet about raising the level of our contribution. With respect to peace and power, however, Lloyd has many successes. Of course, as the Hawks would have it, used to say, he always leant too much towards soft power rather than hard power, as if somehow arms and armies are always the best solution. He was certainly not taking that side. In the Nobel lecture, I remember Mr. Pearson, he lamented that we make more ore. He's talked about scientific advances going beyond our capacity, our moral capacity to keep up, and said that we make war like giants and peace like pygmies. His concerns, Lester B.'s concerns, were very much in those days on nuclear arms, and alas, nowadays, that threat has reappeared in North Korea, and the bulletin, The Atomic Scientist, has moved to 2.5 minutes to midnight. When nuclear disarmament was something Lloyd supported, he focused his power very practically on something that could actually be achieved, and the Anti-Personnel Landmines Treaty was the result. The responsibility to protect also emerged from his use of power, but also from his use to negotiate. So peace and policy, which is the third phase, is of course closely associated with power, but in the best sense, and with Mr. Pearson's mind with the UN and all its multiple activities. Here, Lloyd has been very active, and is in this area that I had my most direct experience with him. 1996, as his advisor on children's rights, I was able to take part in a number of, in a number of international conferences, but most notably, I think that you'll remember the First World Congress Against the Sexual Exploitation of Children that was held in Stockholm in 1996. He led our delegation there, and because he was a foreign minister coming to an issue like this, other countries sent foreign ministers too. It's very important to raising the profile of this extremely most egregious of violations of children's rights to new levels of concern on the international and national agendas. It was at this event that he first met Cherry Kingsley. Cherry was a young, experiential woman who was a member of our delegation. And on our return to Canada, Lloyd asked me to follow up on the commitment we made at Stockholm. And with his authorization, I was able to establish a special committee in the Senate on sexual exploitation and engage a summit, organize a summit of sexually exploited young people from the Americas with Cherry as the co-chair. We worked really well because she stayed up very late at night and I got up early in the morning. But he then asked, and that particular summit actually changed international language, so you no longer talked about juvenile prostitutes, started to talk about young people exploited in the sex trade. That language then, thanks to people like Lloyd, was carried through to the United Nations, became part of international language. A major change, I think, in the way people think about this issue. So he then invited Cherry to come to the UN, you remember, yes, to make a presentation to senior representatives from a number of countries as part of our campaign to seek a seat on the Security Council. The seat that we actually obtained in 1999. It was, I think, an imaginative and inner way to demonstrate a commitment to the world's most vulnerable. A commitment he pursued at the Winnipeg conference, and that it was successful. I mean, it's not only that, there were other things, but that sense that Canada was a country that really cared about the world, I think, was really significant in the votes that we eventually obtained for that. But you continue that commitment, Lloyd, in Winnipeg, at the Winnipeg Conference on Children in Armed Conflict in 2000, where more significant language was negotiated. And he championed the optional protocol to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Today they just talked about it as an optional protocol, but you have to think of it in association with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because that's where it belongs. And Canada was the first to ratify. So Lloyd's commitment to the rights of children continued, and it continued after his retirement from politics, because the last time we interacted officially was again in Winnipeg at his university, where it made it possible for a session on the constructive involvement of the private sector in combating sexual exploitation. That was before the Rideau conference. The fourth of Lester Pearson's Faces of Peace is Peace and People. And it is in this that Lloyd has joined all his distinguished predecessors as laureates of the Pearson Peace Medal. It is fitting, I think, that the first recipient, Cardinal Paul-Émile Léger, was nominated as the co-chair of the Vietnamese Refugee Committee, and that now the 30th has become the chair of the World Refugee Council, confronting the surge of refugees that only continues to grow. And now he's going to have contact with yet another member of the Pearson posse, my daughter Patricia, who is writing, who has been writing on behalf of the United Nations Association of Canada a profile of the 30 recipients. Well, 29, so Lloyd is yet to come. This has been a really moving process for all of us who've been involved, a reminder of who all these extraordinary people were. Every single one of them is or was a humanitarian of the first order.